Okay, check 1 2, check 1 2. Testing, testing. Somebody told me that I should keep those intros short, but I try to do that, but I have to share it to our Discord, so it takes me a minute. But please hit the like button, bell notification. It really helps with the algorithm. Comment any questions that you're going to have in the chat today. If you have any questions and you're watching this after it being live, comment them in the comment section below, and I will address them at some point, either in the next stream or in the comment section. So let me just... your questions. How do you do this? Questions. That's how you spell it. Please. Hit the like button to boost the algorithm. I'm not the best speller either, so that does slow things down. How do you spell algorithm? Algorithm. Give it up. Boost the stream. All right. So tonight it's going to be a good stream. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. Last week I wanted to do this stream, but it was right after Thanksgiving, and I had just gotten back earlier that day, so I postponed it to today because I wanted to give this stream its due. This stream today is on the discussion or theolocution between Michael Levin and Joscha Back on Theories of Everything with Curt Jaimungal. It was a great discussion. Fascinating. I mean, the work of both of those guys, I think, is just some of the most groundbreaking work that's being done in every field. That's there's not even a specific field in which I could say that their work is, specifically applicable to. It's so widely applicable and so wide-ranging in its implications that I think that it applies to many fields. But so we're gonna delve into that. I might move the stream up an hour early in the start of 2023 to around 6-ish, because I realized today that it is 10 p.m. in the East Coast, and that is pretty late, so I may make adjustments. If that's easier, please comment that. Let me know what time works better. If this time works around 7:20 versus 6:20, which is Pacific time, so that will help me schedule things if you guys let me know, because that is more dependent on you guys than it is on me. Please comment in the comment section or in the live chat any questions that you have throughout the stream, and I will address them before the end of the stream. So with that, this is the stream that we're going to be discussing today. This is Theories of Everything with Curt Jaimungal. You should be familiar with this channel at this point if you watch my streams. If not, definitely subscribe. But this is the stream that we're doing, which was the second to most recent. This one looks fascinating too. I haven't watched it yet, but I definitely plan on it. We might do a stream on it at some point, because that's just a great pair to probably have a stream on. But so with that, typical intros. I realize some of these people are repetitive in the intros because we talk about similar people, but that's all right because not everybody has always been here. So Joscha Back, this is a Wikipedia page, says born in Germany in 1973. He's a German artificial intelligence researcher and cognitive scientist focusing on cognitive architectures, mental representation, emotion, social modeling, and multi-agent systems. That is basically the perfect description of his work. I would say, as far as well-known people go in this field of artificial intelligence and multi-agent systems and cognitive, science is a better word than neuroscience, I think. I think that he is probably the cutting-edge voice, but, there are disagreements that I have, but mostly agreements. And then Michael Levin, his background. Here we go. I love when their Wikipedia pages pop up very easily. He is an American developmental and cell biologist at Princeton University, where he is the director of Louis Siegler Institute for Integrative Genomics and professor of molecular biology. He's held appointments at University of California, Berkeley, San Diego, Columbia. Interesting. Yeah. So he's kind of a developmental biologist, I guess you could say. He's very well known for creating xenobots and wait, is this the right guy? Did I just hold on? Let me just make sure. I think I got the wrong guy. That's confusing because that's very similar. Let me just make sure here. Wrong guy. Wow. I thought so. I was like, this doesn't sound familiar. My bad. But, obviously that's very confusing because that's very similar description. Okay. I figured like there was something off. Michael Levin is an American developmental and synthetic biologist at Tufts University, where he is Bush Distinguished Professor. Yeah, this is him. Okay. Born in Moscow, 1969. Okay. Sorry. But he's very well known for his work in what it's called xenobots, where he basically make cellular machines. And he does a lot of work with Planaria, which is used very commonly as a model organism and in scientific experiments. And I think that that's actually, it's not the wrong thing to use that organism, but I don't think that organism is fully understood. There are implications from my work that it is different from most animals that we perceive, and that it's more similar to a plant than it is to an animal, than to most plants. So we'll get into that. But he does amazing work, does a lot of work involving cancer research as well, and I think very highly of just general direction on many things. So my bad. My apologies for reading the wrong person. But they're Michael Levin with an E at the end is a developmental biologist, and Michael Levin with no E on the end is also a developmental biologist. So, that's kind of tough. All right. Let's get to it. So first clip. I really liked in this talk that they talked about different fields not overlapping in academia, and that's what these first couple clips are about, and they had some good comments about it. And I think that's very important when you're looking for a theory of everything. you need competency
Yeah, I suspect that people
and pattern recognition across.
strong disciplinary boundaries do this out of a protective impulse.
Hold on.
And what I noticed by studying many disciplines when I was young.
Okay, you need strong pattern recognition across fields, and that is something that is lacking severely in academia because of segmentation. And in fact, I've talked about this before, but I actually believe that this is a much more true interpretation of the Tower of Babel story in the Bible, where it says, God saw that humanity was building a tower to the heavens, and that means like you're starting to understand and build technologies that will allow you to interact with, I believe, fundamental reality much more so, which means consciousness, or sentience is a better way of putting it, cognition, mind, but we are getting close to that, but we halted for a while because what happened is that God in the story splits all of humanity into a bunch of different languages so that they can't communicate with each other, so that they can't build the tower to heaven. And this isn't Spanish versus English versus Hebrew versus French. It's biology versus chemistry versus physics versus mathematics versus computer science versus neuroscience versus sociology versus morality, metaphysics, etc. So this is what has hindered us from constructing a theory of everything, which is basically the closest that you're going to get to like a tower to heaven. And it doesn't mean you'll become, gods, but that's not, you can't. But because just the definition of God, it excludes you from being able to do that because of the definition of God. But you do get much closer to manipulating fundamental reality, and that is more closely to, aligned with God's realm. So it's much, it makes a lot of sense to think of it as building a tower to heaven. So this is what they're basically talking about, is this this hyperspecialization and segmentation of different fields in academia is kind of hampering innovation. But I also talk about this in my video that I highly recommend you watch if you haven't. It is my entry into the PACE 1 competition put on by Curt Jaimungal, and it is called Theories of Everything, a how-to guide. It's one of my last non-live uploaded videos. It might be my last one, but it talks about field jumping and how this is looked upon very poorly within academia because it appears to invalidate expertise and it offends egos and all kinds of things like that. But it is what is hampering progress to be made. This is what I've also stated, there is no credentials that make you an expert on theories of everything other than constructing a viable or worthy contender for such a theory, because there is no degree in all theories in all fields. So it's a complicated arena to navigate, and it kind of must be done outside of academia for the sake of that. Even if you have academic credentials, it doesn't really matter. But that's what they're talking about here. So here.
That the different methodologies are so incompatible across fields that when I was studying philosophy or psychology, I felt that computer scientists would be laughing about the methods that each of these fields are using to justify what they're doing. Yeah. And this, I think, is indicative of a defect, because if you take science into the current regime of regulating it entirely by peer review, there is no external authority. Even the grant authorities are mostly people who have been trained in the sciences in existing paradigms and then are funding the continuation of those paradigms from the outside. This meta-paradigmatic thinking does not really exist that much in a peer-reviewed paradigm. And ultimately, when you do peer review for a couple generations, it also means that if your peers deteriorate, there is nothing who pulls your science back. And what I miss specifically in a lot of the way in which neuroscience is done is what you call the engineering stance. And this engineering stance is very powerful. You get it automatically when you're a computer scientist because you don't really care what language is it written in. What you care in is what causal pattern is realized.
Yeah.
And how can this be realized? And how could I do it? How would I do it? How can evolution do it? What means are at its disposal? And this determines the search space for the things that I'm looking for. But this requires that I think in causal systems. And this thinking in causal systems is not impossible to, it's possible not to do for a computer scientist. But it is unusual outside of computer science. And once you realize that, it's very weird. Yeah. And suddenly you have notions that try to replace causal structure with, say, evidence. And then you notice that, for instance, evidence-based medicine is not about probabilities of how something is realized and must work. Like you see people on a cruise ship getting infected over distances, and you think, oh, this must be airborne. But no, there is no peer-controlled study, so there is no evidence that it's airborne. And when you look at its disciplines from the outside, like in this case, the medical profession or the medical messaging and decision making, or I get terrified because it directly affects us. And in terms of neuroscience, of course, that is more theoretical for the most part, but there must be a reason why it's for the most part atheoretical, why there is no causal model that clinicians can use to explain what is happening in certain syndromes that people are exhibiting. And I noticed this when I go to a doctor, and even at a reputable institution like Stanford, that most of the neuroscientists at some level there, or most of the neurologists that I'm talking to are at some level dualists, that they don't have a causal model of the way in which the brain is realizing things. And a lot of studies which discover that very simple mechanisms like the ability of human beings to use grammatical structure are actually reflected in the brain. This is so amazing. Who would have thought? Yeah, but the developments that existed in computer science have led us on a completely different track. There is the perceptron is vaguely inspired by what the brain might be doing, but I think it's really a toy model or a caricature of what cells are doing. Not in this.
Okay, so we're going to talk about this for a bit because he's totally right. So this has been my main issue also with neuroscience, because there is no explanations given that are really, there's very few explanations given that are very compelling, that are able to explain patterns that are seen in the field. And the reason for this is because they want everything to be reducible to physicality as we currently understand it to be. And that is not actually possible, because there are structures that are responsible for physicality that are also what are responsible for cognition, and therefore influence cognition and dictate and guide and direct cognition in certain ways that that are totally counter to the narrative in most of the academic arena. And because of that, neuroscience is making very little progress. Computer science is making a lot more progress, and that's why people who make progress in neuroscience come a lot from computer science world. And even that is limited because, like he said, it's toy models. It's still just fancy mathematics and fancy math equations that are just creating decision trees essentially, and that's not that, like, it cannot get you there to agency. It cannot get you to agency is the point. It's a tool of agency. That's why we can use it, and it's a tool. That's why your computer and Excel and all these programs that can run within Excel, you can write in an equation and double tap it and it just runs it. And your computer does the same thing with all kinds of programs and games and all kinds of things. And they're just fancy math equations, but your computer has no sentience, but it's able to be used as a tool by someone with agency, meaning the user of the computer, even though the computer has no agency itself. So we are in neuroscience. Computer science is helping us to understand how we compute space-time structures a lot of in some ways, but because space-time is computational, that's the nature of space-time, and its emergence is that it is computational. That's why there's a limit on, the speed of causality, and which is the speed of light, and it's the same thing as having a limit on the RAM of your computer. But that is not super related to agency. It's a tool of agency. It's an emergent perspective of agents, but it is not responsible for agency. And so because of that, even computer science has its limits in its ability to explain and agency and get us to things like consciousness or general intelligence, which are completely linked. You can't have a generally intelligent being system without it being a being, and that means it has to be self-aware and sentient. But I agree with Joscha on much of what he said, and it's why I think that academia it's impossible for a theory of everything to come out in academia, because academia is built entirely on a system that fundamentally is credentials that are field specific. And because how do you have credentials in everything? The nature of credentials themselves mean that they require a specific context in order to be understood within, and that context is limited always. So you can't have credentials in fields that are theories of everything. But and you really almost means you can't have credentials in metaphysics, which is what worries me, but also I don't think it should, but it just does. It concerns me, not worries me, when it comes to presenting a theory or about the nature of fundamental reality. It will almost certainly be misunderstood by academia, and that is because I think almost the closest circumstance that you can get to under a field that that can understand a theory of everything is honestly theology or philosophy. But that's about it. Physics can't do it. Mathematics can't do it. They can help you with the computations that occur, and they can even help you map symmetry patterns if you're talking about quantum mechanics and standard model and quantum physics and stuff. But even that, it's not the same as Newtonian or physics or general relativity or anything like that. That's all computational, but the standard model is not computational. It's about symmetries. So this is a big problem. If we're looking to academia to give us a description of fundamental reality, we will not get it. We might get it from people who have credentials from academia, but ultimately, so what? Other than you being accepted, I have thought about going back to school and getting a PhD in philosophy, but the issue is that I would only be doing it to be more accepted by people in academia, and that goes against my entire perspective on where we should be heading in this. I think we need a new paradigm of education entirely. So I would be a hypocrite, and that's limiting me. I have a very serious conflict that I've been going through lately because of it. So it's a constraint of the current system. So they also talked about how memory appears to be stored outside the brain, and that is something that sentient singularity theory it implies as well. Memory in sentient singularity theory is not going to be something that that neuroscientists are going to be able to explain. They might be able to manipulate it to some degree, or manipulate the appearance of it, but not actually understand memory. But we'll get to that in a minute. Next clip is about that.
A guy named James McConnell in Michigan, actually in the U.S., and then that was in the '60s, the early '60s, and then there was some really interesting Russian work that picked it up after that. We reproduced some of it recently in using modern quantitative automation and things like this. But one of the really cool aspects of this, and there's a whole community, by the way, with people like Randy Gallistel and Sam Gershman and of course David Glantzman, and people who are that story of memory in the precise details of the synapses. That story is really starting to crack, actually, for a number of reasons. One of the cool things that was done in the Russian work, and it was also done later on by Doug Blackiston, who's in my lab now as a staff scientist, and other people, is this: you can certain animals that go through larval stages, right? So you can take, so what the Russians were using beetle larvae, and Doug and other people used moths and butterflies. So what happens is you train the larva. Right. So here you've got a caterpillar. So this caterpillar lives in a two-dimensional world. It's a soft-bodied robot. It lives in a two-dimensional world. It eats leaves and so on. Right. And so you train this thing for a particular task. Well, during metamorphosis, it needs to become a moth or butterfly, which it lives in a three-dimensional world. Plus, it's a hard-bodied creature. So the controller is completely different, right, for running this.
I will say I don't agree with that description. A caterpillar does not live in a two-dimensional world. That's to say that we live in a two-dimensional world. We don't live in a two-dimensional world. We also exist in a three-dimensional world. We climb over things, we maneuver around things, we go under things, and just because we don't have wings doesn't mean that we exist in a two-dimensional world, and that same exact truth goes for caterpillars. They absolutely perceive things in a three-dimensional world. I mean, I've seen this with countless insects that don't have wings. They obviously maneuver in a three-dimensional world. How does a spider, create a web in midair if it doesn't maneuver in a three-dimensional world? Of course it maneuvers in a three-dimensional world. There is only a three-dimensional world plus time, So if you're inside the universe, their universe is inherently three-dimensional and plus three spatial dimensions and one time temporal dimension in your perspective. But that's caused by your perception. But it's a constraint of your perception. You can't actually exist and live in a two-dimensional world if you are like a caterpillar. There might be beings that do exist in a two-dimensional world, but they are not multicellular organisms. So,
yeah, for running a caterpillar versus a butterfly. So during that process, what happens is the brain is basically dissolved. So most of the connections are broken. Most of the cells are gone. They die. You put together a brand new brain. It self-assembles. And you can ask all sorts of interesting philosophical questions of what it's like to be a creature whose brain is undergoing this massive change. But the information remains. And so one can ask, okay, this is, certainly for computer science, it's amazing to have a memory medium that can survive this radical remodeling and reconstruction. And there's the RNA story, but also you had mentioned, does this work for mammals? So there was a guy in the 70s and 80s. There was a guy named George Ungar who did he's got tons of papers. He reproduced it in rats. So his was fear of the dark, and he actually by establishing this assay and then fractionating their brains and extracting this activity. Now he thought it was a peptide, not RNA. So he ended up with a thing called scotophobin, which turns out to be, I think, an 8-mer peptide or something. And the claim was that you can transfer this scotophobin, you can synthesize it and then transfer it from brain to brain. And that's what he thought it was. And then of course I think David Glanzman favors RNA again. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a super important story of how it is that this kind of information can survive just massive remodeling of the cognitive substrate. In Planaria, what we did, and Planaria, they have a true centralized brain. They have all the same neurotransmitters that we have. They're not a simple organism. What we did was McConnell's first experiments, which is to train them on something, and we trained them to recognize a laser etched kind of bumpy pattern on the bottom of the dish, and to recognize that that's where their food was going to be found. So they made this association between this pattern and getting food. And then we cut their heads off, and we took the tails, and the tails sit there for 10 days doing nothing, and then eventually they grow a new brain. And what happens is that information is then imprinted onto the new brain, and then you can recover behavioral evidence that they remember the information. So that's pretty cool too, because it suggests that, well, we don't know if the information is everywhere or if it's in other places in the peripheral nervous system or in the in the nerve core, that we don't know where it is yet. But it's clear that it can move around, that the information can move around in the body, because it can be in the posterior half and then imprinted onto the brain, which actually drives all the behaviors.
Okay, so I think that assembly theory is probably going to be very useful in understanding memory. I think that if you look at assembly theory currently, and its description of kind of a universal memory is basically positional or entanglement relationships. I don't know if this is the exact language that they would use, but I think that this is basically the general idea. And this is also supported by my work with sentient singularity theory, is that memory it comes from, it's stored in entanglement relationships between agents in the universe. And so but the thing is about these agents is that there's many more of them than we currently classify as agents, and because of that there's much more information that's able to be stored than you would currently think. So that like, for instance, let's say a water molecule is entangled with, or not say water molecule, let's say a molecule of carbon is entangled with another molecule of carbon, okay, and they're forming part of the diamond on your, the engagement ring that you buy your wife. That memory of getting a diamond is partially stored in past or present entanglement relationships of even that diamond. It's not just that, but that's a very, very small part. But I'm using it as an example because there's so much entanglement relationships that are feeding into your perception every single time that you perceive anything as a human being. And those entanglement relationships are responsible for everything from, the state of matter that you're observing, whether it's a solid or a liquid or a gas, or to the shape of the matter that you are perceiving. So whether or not you're perceiving, I don't know, like a pen, these titanium molecules in this titanium pen are all entangled with each other in such a way that they form a solid where you cannot move one without affecting all the others in a certain way. And that entire assembly picture of the cosmos is what stores memory, according to sentient singularity theory, and I think will also be the direction that assembly theory takes things, and that means that it's stored everywhere. But here's the thing. So while I think that Michael Levin is definitely onto something in where he's recognizing where it's not stored, or it's not just stored in the brain, it's not, the brain is the physically perceived, it's the physical perception of the entanglement knot at the center of the strings of information that make up you and me. That's why it looks like a knot, and it's the entanglement point. So when you remove parts of the brain, you're not actually destroying memories. You're cutting people off from their ability to access them currently, because you're cutting the strings of entangled information, but you're not actually cutting out memory. It's like people think that it's like stored in the brain. It's not stored in the brain, or at least not just in the brain. It's not in the brain at all, but there are entanglement relationships within cells within your brain, and that are, part of a memory, but they're not even enough to destroy the memory entirely, if they were to be, disappeared. But this is it's a good direction to recognize that the current direction is wrong. But I also think that planaria are very, very valuable organisms from an experimentational standpoint, but they're not the same as like a frog. And according to my work with sentient singularity theory's suggestion, and I've studied this before, my work implies that there is a dualistic manifestation of collective intelligence, and one of them is a sentient being, and the other one is described in my work as a corporism. And it's basically a corporation of cells that doesn't actually have a central sentient body that is part of it. Coca-Cola can be split in two. You can take the CEO and the CFO of Coca-Cola and you can cut them off, aka fire them, and they can go and they can start Mr. Pibb, or Big Red, or I don't know, what's another, Pepsi. They can start Pepsi. And then all of a sudden you've got two corporisms and it's like two planaria. I believe, based on my work, most plants are probably this, but few animals, with one of the exceptions being planaria, and that most animals would be sentient beings and not corporisms, but most plants would be corporisms and not sentient beings. Now, the cells inside all of these beings, corporisms and sentient beings, are all sentient, or at least most of them probably. So, still, working on that, and I have some ideas for some experiments in the future, to test different types of cells to see if some are kind of corporisms themselves of molecules, and they are not in and of themselves sentient. But that's down the line. As of right now, I think it's, for the sake of understanding, it's probably fine to just say cells are sentient. But there might be some that are not. And those would be cells probably that are cut off from building bigger structures. Like the cells in your body would probably be sentient. The molecules in those cells would probably be sentient. The atoms in those molecules would probably be sentient. And it's when you get to a non-sentient structure, like a corporism, like planaria, it's probably incapable of becoming part of something bigger. And at least completely. So there's probably more constraints to it than that, but that's kind of general implication thus far. But that is why I think it'd be important, if you're gonna look at experiments regarding this stuff, to have a contrasting worm that is more likely to be a sentient being than a planaria like C. elegans. So you would want a worm that, if you don't cut it into 200 pieces, you don't get 200 new worms. The fact that you can cut a planaria into 200 pieces and get 200 new worms is evidence that it's not a sentient being. It's a collective of sentient beings that are working together and form an emergent structure that is kind of governed by goals that are dictated by the constraints of the system. And so you can see this with companies as well. So if you look at companies all have the very specific structure. So you have like, you have a board of directors, and you have a CEO, and you have a CFO, and you have like, somebody on the assembly line, and you have marketers, and you have engineers, and this is true of every single company. Why is it true of every single company? Why isn't there companies that don't have any of these things? And I'm not saying there isn't different types of companies, but there is a general constraints that are put on every single one that limit the different possibilities that are available. There isn't endless possibilities of different types of companies. There is a finite amount, even if there's multiple. And that's true of corporisms as well, and which would be a collective of cells that are not forming a collective that is actually sentient, but is able to work together towards a common goal and would give the appearance almost of being sentient. But you'd be able to tell based on certain bits of evidence, like being able to chop it into 200 pieces and then making a bunch of different ones. And also, there is much more evidence that my theory on Planaria is correct, that is presented in this stream, and that I wasn't aware of. And I think that Michael Levin's work is going to prove to be extraordinary beyond what it has already been proven to be. But I also think that there's going to be some, for it to truly take its progress to the next level. I think, based on my work at least, you're going to have to recognize this differentiation between Planaria and like a C. elegans worm, which I believe does not split when you cut it in half. I think it dies, which is evidence that it's a sentient singularity according to my theory, sentient singularity theory. It's sentient being. It is one. So it's basically, that means that the cells that make it up are, within a normal structure at least, emotionally entangled, completely entangled, which means like metaphysically emotionally entangled. Sentience is defined by emotion, and so that's why that's the case. But but think about it like this: if my cells get damaged, I hurt. Okay, and if I hurt, my cells are hurting as well. And like, there is no differentiation there for the most part. Even cancer cells, okay? So like, if you start having cancer and you have this division happening between cells that no longer recognize themselves as part of the collective, they've lost their way, they are now, just hedonists and, self-centered hedonists basically, and they're no longer recognizing any sense of responsibilities to the whole. That is exactly what's happening. And if the cancer kills you, you're dead. And the cancer's dead. Okay? That means that there's a total entanglement happening there. If you go, your cells go. They're done. That's not true with, a corporation where I can be fired. They can lay off, 50 members of their workforce, and you can, fire the CEO, and which is like cutting off the head of a Planaria. You can fire the entire board of directors. You can be Elon Musk, come in and just like bulldoze everybody who's currently working there and cut it, 70% or whatever he did. Twitter goes on. Why? Because it's not a single being. It's a collective of beings working towards a common goal, but they're not entirely entangled. They're entangled based on their goal, but not of their fate. And that's not true of a sentient singularity. I do think humans will become the cells of a sentient singularity eventually. And when that's the case, it means its fate is tied to our fate. So like it's going to be a total revolution in how we even understand everything. But so this is very important if you're going to understand Planaria, and we're going to get more into that later. But I believe it is what I call a corporism, and instead of an organism. And so, here, let's see the chat real quick. What's going on? Memes of destruction. Vlad, reckon with the brain is an antenna for the mind. It's not an antenna. I know a lot of people say that. The brain is not an antenna. It's the physical manifestation of the entanglement point of information, of a knot of information, essentially, of strings of information. So if you imagine a hop vibration, which is like a fiber bundle, like this, imagine that there's strings go on, okay? Not just like this. But the center point where all of those strings of information cross, there's a physical perception, a physical manifestation that we can perceive of that point of intersection of strings of information. That's what a brain is. We're just knots on the cosmic macrame, that's a sentient being in and of itself, on the mental cosmic macrame. And I think Brian Keating said that about my model. He didn't specify that it was my work, but he said, I have a friend who has this cosmic macrame once on a stream, and I'm pretty sure he's talking about my work. But that's what we are. We don't need an antenna. We are connected always to the greater sentience, to God, to the cosmic mind. We don't need an antenna to connect to it. I don't think that it's an antenna. I think that that model of it is helpful in some ways, because it starts to get you away from the idea that we're just this disconnected, entity from everything else that is just plain, inanimate material around us, because that's not a helpful model. I think the antenna idea is more helpful, but it's not actually true, so its helpfulness is limited. So I don't think that we're an antenna. But I understand why the model is more helpful than the academically accepted model. We're more connected than an antenna. If the mind was an antenna, we'd be more disconnected from the cosmic mind than we are. We're more connected to each other, to the cosmic mind, than we would be if our mind was an antenna. Because an antenna is necessary to access some type of disconnect. We're not disconnected. We have the perception of disconnection, but we're not actually disconnected. Plants might be just super slow animals. There are certain plants that are probably sentient singularities, but they are super slow. I mean, beings, or there are super slow cellular organisms, I guess you could say, even if they're corporisms. But that's just that. I mean, if you look at the time lapse of a jungle, you'll see vines fighting each other, but those vines might not be individual entities. They might be like competing companies. It might be like Coke is fighting Pepsi, and we're just witnessing it in a time lapse of the jungle. So. +3 for the Mr. Pibb reference. Miss H. Oh no, those some giant theories. Yeah, they are. Wait, but how do twins and triplets work? Well, they talk about it on here. I don't know exactly what you mean by that, though. How do the twins and triplets work? They're not. Twins and triplets are each sentient beings in and of themselves. I don't think it's what I don't think anything I said is particularly relevant to twins and triplets. But if you think I'm misunderstanding, let me know. Tyler, sounds like your model has a lot of overlap with my friend Jen from the Church of Entropy on YouTube channel. I've seen that channel. I need to look more into it. And I think I've seen her website. There's like a lot of memes on it, I'm pretty sure. If that's right, let me know. But I think I've seen a little bit of Jen's work. I haven't looked much into it, but I have like clicked around on her website before, I think. They came from a single fertilized egg if identical. Yes. So same as these worms. No. There is, but that's a good point, but it's not the same because they're coming from a structure that isn't one of them. So like it would be more relevant to say like if you tore me in half, then you'd have two identical Tylers that split from there. That would be more like Planaria. But you don't do that. Yes, a cell, like an egg or an embryo, is technically like a being that at some point achieves individual sentience, but we don't know exactly when that is. It's probably very early, by the way, like around the time of identical twins forming, not like weeks in or something like that. So I'm not suggesting that like there's no sentience to a fetus or anything like that. I don't believe that that's the case. I do believe that they have sentience, but I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, if you look at a pregnant woman's belly, you could see like looks like an alien. Like it's like handprints coming and like pushing on it and stuff like that. But there's someone in there. But I think that there is some stage maybe where for identical twins or triplets where a division is created before individual sentience is created. So it'd be very, very, very early on in embryonic like development. Love when Tyler gets all metaphysical. How does this tie back to the title of this live? It completely does. I'm late to the discussion. You'll see. I'm gonna play another clip in a minute. We're in this together, and we're together forever. Yes, that's true. Snap into Slim Jim. I don't understand, but isn't that that's a commercial, right? Sounds like metaphysics. It's not like War of the Titans, though. It's metaphysics, and yes, we are memes. I mean, metaphysics play out like the War of the Titans. Yes, and there's aspects of metaphysics that are like that, and War of the Titans, those myths are descriptions of those patterns playing out. So absolutely, Macho Man reference. Okay. Sentient beings is a mythical human choice. I don't understand. Is it a choice for us to be a sentient being? I think that if you have the choice to be sentient, then you're already sentient. But next clip is right here. Okay. Let's see this.
Reading a lot of neuroscience. It's really mostly the result of people thinking about statistics of data processing. And it would be great if we would focus on ideas that are promising and new and that have the power to shake existing paradigms.
Yeah. This is so important, and it's not just neuroscience. In developmental biology, we have exactly the same thing, and I'll just give you two very simple examples of it. And I tell the students when I give talks to students, I say, "Isn't it amazing that in your whole course of biology in your developmental biology textbook, there's not a mention of any of this, because it completely just undermines a lot of the basic assumptions. So here's a couple of examples. One example is of trophic memory in deer. So there are species of deer that every year they regenerate the whole, so they make this antler rack on their heads, the whole thing falls off, and then it regrows the next year. So these two guys, Bobenek, which are a father and son team that did these experiments for 40 years, and actually have all these antlers in my lab now, because when the younger one retired, I asked that he sent me all these things, all these antlers. The idea is this: what you can do is you take a knife, and somewhere in this branch structure, you make a wound, and the bone will heal, and you get a little callus, and that's it for that year. Then the whole thing drops off, and then next year it starts to grow, and it will make an ectopic tine, an ectopic branch at the point where you injured it last year. And this goes on for 5 or 6 years, and then eventually it goes away, and you get a normal rack again. And so the amazing thing about it is that, as the standard models for patterning, for morphogenesis, are these kind of gene regulatory networks and genetic kinds of biochemical gradients and so on. If you try to come up with a model for this, so for encoding an arbitrary point within a branch structure that your cells at the scalp have to remember for months after the whole thing is dropped off, and then not only remember it, but then implement it so that when the bone starts to grow, something says, oh yes, that's the start another tine growing to your left exactly here, right? Trying to make a model of this using the standard tools of the field is just incredibly difficult. And this is and there are other examples of this, but this kind of non-genetic memory that's just very difficult to explain with standard models. The other thing, which is I think an even bigger scandal, is the whole situation with Planaria. Planaria, some species of Planaria, the way they reproduce is they tear themselves in half. Each half regenerates the missing piece, and now you've got two. That's how they reproduce. So if you're going to do that, what you end up avoiding is Weissman's barrier, this idea that when we get mutations in our body, our children don't inherit those mutations, right? So this means that any mutation that doesn't kill the stem cell in the body gets amplified as that cell contributes to regrowing the worm. So as a result of this, for 400 million years, these Planaria have accumulated mutations. Their genomes are an incredible mess. Their cells are basically mixoploid, meaning they're like a tumor. Every cell has a different number of chromosomes potentially. They just look, it just looks horrible. As an end result, you've got an animal that is immortal, incredibly good at regenerating with 100% fidelity, and very resistant to cancer. Now, all of this is the exact opposite of the message you get from a typical course through biology, which says that, what is the genome for? The genome is for setting your body structure. And if you mess with the genome, that information goes away. You get aging, you get cancer, right? Why does the animal with the worst genome have the best anatomical fidelity? I mean, that just, and I think we actually, as of a few months ago, we actually, I think, have some insight into this. But it's been bugging me for years, and this is the kind of thing that nobody ever talks about, because it goes against the general assumption of what genomes actually do and what they're for. And this complete lack of correlation between the genome, in fact, an anti-correlation between the genome quality and the incredible ability of this animal to have a healthy anatomy. Yeah.
Okay. So much great stuff there. So, by the way, these statements that he has made are very supportive of my theory regarding Planaria being what I call a corporism. And I came to this kind of idea quite a while ago, probably over a year ago at this point, but every time I listen to Michael Levin, he tells me something new about Planaria that further support my theory on what it is, and that it's not exactly a single sentient organism. There's something else going on with this animal. And I think it's fine to call it an animal, but I think animals and plants both are going to need to be split into two new structures where you have organisms and corporisms. So you'll have plants. There's 4 primary perspectives in sentient singularity theory that will map out basically into any structure that you want to observe that's objective. If you want to actually map out animals, instead of having all this, kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species, blah, 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 like, subspecies. By the way, all of this is so arbitrary. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And I know that because I follow herpetology extremely closely, and I study reptiles every day. I have plenty of them over there that are reproducing, and I've taken them multiple generations. And one of the things that's interesting is that every few decades they go and someone comes in, wants to make a name for themselves, decides to do something because they're bored and there's not much left to do in the specific niche that they've picked, at least from their perspective, so other than to undo everything that's already been done. So, for instance, there's a species of lizard called a water monitor. It is the second largest lizard in the world. Varanus salvator is the scientific name, and it comes from all these different islands in Indonesia, and it has all these different variations on these different islands, and they split them up before into a bunch of different subspecies, and this was the golden one, and this one is the this other nominate form, and then there's this form that's speckled and such. And I thought that subspecies was a kind of decent enough and categorization, and then one day somebody came in and they were like, no, these are all different species, even though they're clearly not. This one's like a little smaller than the other one's, more yellow, and this one's like black, and other than that they're the same. And this is just so arbitrary. If we want to look at organisms, or multicellular organisms, I guess you could say, then we're probably going to split things more objectively at first. If you're gonna, I'm not saying that none of this subjective differentiation is useful. It absolutely is. Just because there is the existence of objectivity doesn't mean that subjectivity is wrong. It just means that it's subjective and situation specific. And the only time in which I would say these things are not differentiation between species is truly objective is when you cannot reproduce with another individual anymore. Like you've diverged to the point where there's no longer the ability to remerge back. And other than that, and I'm not talking about like people will be like, well, there's a mountain range, separating them so they don't interbreed. That doesn't matter. It's like, can they genetically, if one of them wanders over the mountain range, what's going to happen to it? And but other than that, pretty much subjective. But I think that we're gonna, if we really want to understand what we currently define as multicellular life, then currently we have animals and plants, and we have other categories as well, and we'll talk more about that. But if we're going to want to understand animals and plants, at least, because a lot of the other categories are single cellular, then you're going to have animals and plants, and you're going to have corporisms and organisms, I think, and that most plants would probably be corporisms, and some might be organisms, and most animals, what we call animals, would be organisms, but some would be corporisms. And I think that Planaria is one of these few animals that is a corporism. It's different than an earthworm. Someone once told me that earthworms reproduced by cutting in half, and I remember I was a little kid, and I was probably like 5, and I found a bunch of earthworms in my grandparents' backyard, and my brother and I cut them in half because we thought that like they would make more of them. And I remember feeling distraught and just terrible when I realized that I just killed these earthworms because they did not reproduce. They died on the stoop. So I felt pretty bad about that. But that's not true at Planaria. You cut them in half, makes another one. Also, as he says here, all their genes are so screwed up where the different cells in a single Planaria have different genomes. They're not connected completely. What this is similar to is a company in which the individuals within the company do not share a common lineage, okay? And, you have Josh, and his lineage is very different than Tina in HR, and there's different genes. There's not a cohesion between their genes really that shows a common lineage, within the company that they're working for, beyond the company they're working for, sure. But within the company, no, there's no common lineage where like everybody's part of the PepsiCo lineage. And that's very indicative of something going on where there's a lack of entanglement happening. And what's interesting is that what's another structure that's eternal? This is another hint that I'm correct about Planaria being a corporism, is that it lives eternally. Okay? Disney won't die. It doesn't. It's like it's become competent at one thing, which is making money. It's not even competent at making good movies anymore. But it's competent enough at maximizing shareholder value or whatever it is that they're doing, and it will not die. It doesn't matter if you fire the CEO and hire someone else, and then fire him and rehire the old CEO. Like, all of these things have happened to Apple, to Disney, to Pepsi, and it doesn't matter. It goes on. And sometimes these companies are divided, and sometimes mergers happen. And all of this is similar patterns that you can perceive in Planaria. I'm not saying mergers are apparent in Planaria. That is not something I'm aware of. It is something that would be a fascinating thing to try and study, and I suggest that to Michael Levin, is trying to merge two Planaria into one Planaria. If you can do that, then it would further suggest that my theory is correct. But even if it's difficult, or not difficult, but even if it requires a special set of circumstances. But, actually, I'm pretty sure that this has been done, where they ground up Planaria and then they fed them to other Planaria, and the information from the ground up ones was transferred to the ones that ate the pieces. I think this has happened. I'm not sure. I need to double check this, but this is a merger in action, essentially. And information was transferred, if I'm not correct, in those experiments. And I hope I'm not botching the description too much, but I would need to look it up to be sure. But that is because the individuals were absorbed, and their information was not totally destroyed. Some of those individuals probably became directly parts of the Planaria instead of actually were being like digested. The cells just became a part of the whole. Not all of them necessarily, but probably some. And that's fascinating. But the fact that they live eternally is a sign that it's not a sentient singularity definitions here are difficult because our current definitions are both too limited and too broad. Too limited in certain circumstances, too broad in other circumstances to actually totally align with objective structures. So that's why I don't know whether or not using the word organism or even animal or something like that is the right terminology, but that's why I've just broken it into, in my theory, sentient singularities and corporisms. These are two different structures. They are both entanglement structures. They're both unified collectives. One of them is totally entangled. The other one is not. And where they share fate. And emotions essentially are or feelings, not emotions specifically, but feelings in general, which are pretty similar to emotions, are shared by the entirety of the individuals that make up the collective and the individual that is the collective. Whereas Planaria, I don't think there is an individual. There's no individual. Like, who is Pepsi? We don't know. There is no someone who is Pepsi. And in fact, what's interesting is that as soon as there is no one who is a certain company, which that's like Apple at the beginning with Steve Jobs, or even when it's in its day of really innovating, it's almost like it was headed by a sentient structure, at least. Okay, I'll say that. It was headed by a sentient structure, which is someone with specific goals. And those goals are not to make money and maximize shareholder value. Those goals are are specific. So like Steve Jobs, it was to make handheld devices to access technology and interact with technology in a way that was enjoyable and functional. With Elon Musk and SpaceX, he has very specific goals for SpaceX. With Tesla, he has very specific goals for Tesla. As soon as Elon Musk is no longer the CEO of Tesla, or Twitter even, or which has very specific goals right now, when Steve Jobs was no longer the CEO of Apple, where these people, these true sentient singularities, these true sentient beings are the heads of these organizations, the amount of innovation that they can do becomes very limited, and they all of a sudden just start iterating. Okay, like after Steve Jobs, Apple is just basically iterating. Twitter, after it became public, it just became kind of iterative, and it shared, the same values that every company claims to share, but it doesn't have any values. There's no values to a company. Like equality is not a value that a company has. But companies have no values. Okay, individuals have values. Companies do not have values. They are not individuals, and so they might claim to have certain values, but maybe certain companies in their early stages have values. Like I've witnessed this with every company that I've ever worked for. Is that that I've worked for long enough is like when you get in early. It starts off as this like startup type environment where you're very good at solving problems. You're able to outcompete the competition, and the competition is bloated and old and has apparently endless resources that it has no idea what to do with, and then it just kind of gets crappier and crappier over time, like the news organizations or like Google today. I'm not saying Google isn't making innovations, but it's like very small teams at Google. And but overall, they've just kind of continued to make a crappier search engine over time, and their tools are getting worse. And I know that because I work as an advertiser. Like I use Google Ads, and I can tell you what it was like when it first came out, towards when it first came out, and what it's like now, and it is very different. So. But you get this common structure that keeps happening, and that is very similar to Planaria. And what's interesting is that at these companies like Google now and Twitter, before Elon Musk took over, and Apple more, commonly, and many of these companies, incompetence is growing in terms of their ability for you to have people that can really, really solve problems and are very, very individually competent. Individual competence in their workforce is decreasing. The company is still going on, and this has happened to every company once it reaches a sufficient size or sufficient or specific structure, and that. Those size and structure cause constraints where the people at the bottom are no longer in direct communication with the people at the top. And as soon as that happens, company's gone. In its ability to be innovative, it's no longer able to really outpace the competition and solve new problems. That doesn't mean certain teams on those companies are not able to solve problems, but they have to be very isolated and very specific. And they have to have a lot of freedom, a lot more than is normally given to them. So, but this it results in this, all of a sudden, this common structure that always comes out, and every single company claims to have the same values, and they all claim with this one collective voice to be unified and against everything, and this implies like a unified structure to some degree, and the people running those companies continue to just be incompetent. And you can see this when you watch Disney Plus shows and movies, and you'll see that like the writers suck, the animation is getting worse, all of this competency is just being destroyed, but yet the structure continues to go on. And this is what you see with Planaria. It's like it never dies. It doesn't get cancer. Yet it's individuals. The individuals that make it up are often, competent to a certain specific thing, but they're not necessarily like competent in their ability to innovate. And even though they are competent in their ability to be a part of Planaria, and that's it. That doesn't mean they have individual competency. It means like they aid in the collective competency somehow, even though they individually suck to some degree. But this is also what he goes on to say, where he says things like, Planaria have, well, we'll get to it, but there's another aspect that he says here that, again, further supports my hypothesis that Planaria are corporisms, is that there's basically no genetic mutations, aka adaptations. We call these mistakes. We were like, oh, that's a genetic mistake. Sometimes it can be, but it's really an innovation. And sometimes those innovations fail, and sometimes they succeed. But there's no innovation that happens in Planaria. You have to externally induce it, and he talks about this, where there's no morphs. Okay, there's no like genetic mutations in Planaria that you'd find in like fruit flies, where like there's fruit flies that then have deformed wings, and then they become flightless fruit flies. That's another very common organism in labs. And these fruit flies have white eyes, and these fruit flies have red eyes, and you can kind of see that kind of stuff. That doesn't seem to happen in Planaria, according to Michael Levin, and that further supports the idea that this is a corporism. It's very, very limited in its ability to innovate, and that is because there is a lack of communication happening, and a lack of entanglement. Because there's a lack of entanglement between the individual cells that make up a Planaria. It's like, you can be, even if you are brilliant and you work at Apple, but the thing is like Apple's trying to maintain it's not trying to rock the boat. It's trying to continue to be a functional corporation that maximizes shareholder value and doesn't rock the boat, and continues to pump out things that people line up to buy, even though they're not that different from the things that they already bought. And there's a lack of mutation happening. Okay? Mutations are not screw-ups. Sometimes they're screw-ups, but sometimes they're innovations. And that is lacking in Planaria. Something is suppressing the ability for innovation to happen within the structure that we assume is an animal, that we call, the animal that is Planaria, the worm. So it's fascinating. It's so fascinating to me that this is happening. But when he's talking also about these deer, and you etch, the antler of the deer, and the deer's antler falls off, and the next year the antler grows back, and there's like a deformation in where the etching, I guess you could say, had happened the previous year. That supports what I said earlier about assembly theory, and how information, aka memory, that's what information is stored outside of it's not stored purely locally. Not saying it's not also stored locally, what we would define as locally, but it's also stored beyond local relationships. So That's interesting, and it's not just stored in the brain, it's at all. So, stealing collective competency. I'm totally stealing that one. Hence the bait for the nature of sentient beings. Search results. That is a very high gap to stabilize. Okay, wait, I'm reading this backwards. Well done, Tyler. I think you got me on that splitting before they become an entity bit. Okay, order of operations is critical. Yes, it's critical. I think sentient is only a matter regarding computation. It is not. It's not about computation. Sentient beings compute, but sentience is not about computation. It's about it's about coherence of information. That interview made me think about human cognition from an autistic perspective. It was good understanding a machine, not so much for living biological lineal matter. That scientists will never talk about consciousness in public because his job is only to investigate the regenerating function of that living organism. Movie making business is as important as a confectionery company. Very important. Yes, that's true. Merger, a word that will plow to new perspective. Fauci is science. Jennifer's website has a lot of memes. Brilliant woman. Her website is like the mixed up flies from Mr. Basil's. Mrs. Basil's Eve Frank Willer. I don't know what that is, but yeah, then I have seen her work a bit. They bet against equilibrium. I think their searches are controlled. Oh, Google. There is innovation. If in a flatworm manifestation, the worm entangles with the host. In a flatworm infestation, the worm entangles with the host. Interesting. If not bait, there is selective violation to hijack a biologically tested dissimilar beings. I don't know what you mean. Okay, well, next clip. This is about the definition of competence we just kind of talked about. And yeah, it's important.
Other cells to get the job done. So that's what I meant. So to me, to make any kind of a cognitive claim, you have to specify the problem space. You have to specify the goal towards which it's expressing competencies, and that may and then you can make a claim about, well, how competent is it to get to that goal? And somebody, I wish I could remember who it was, but somebody made this really nice analogy about kind of the ends of that spectrum. They said two magnets try to get together, and Romeo and Juliet try to get together. But the degree of flexible problem solving that you can expect out of those two systems is incredibly different. And within that range, there are all kinds of in-between systems that may be better or worse and may deploy different kinds of strategies. You know, can they avoid local optima? Can they have a memory of where they've been? Can they look further than their local environment? A million different things. So that's what I meant by competency. It's a claim about what an engineer can expect the system to do, given a particular problem space and a particular goal that you think it's trying to reach.
So
I talk about this all the time. Competency is goal dependent, but not just like it's not just competency that's goal dependent. There's competency in everything is goal dependent, which means it's like everything is goal dependent. Okay. Jordan Peterson, when he was talking with Curt Jaimungal when Curt was interviewed on Jordan Peterson's channel, which I highly recommend watching as well. They discussed my definition of, not my definition, but my statements about, the search for God and the definition of God, in that talk, but it was very good. And but that in that Jordan Peterson that talk, Jordan Peterson's like talking about a table, and he's like, "What is a table? Is it a rectangular thing with four, protrusions, or is it a sitting down to eat place?" And there's a lot of things that are rectangular with four protrusions that are not what we would call a table. But, you can make a table with no legs, and it's just, a rectangle, and you can set it in the middle of the room, or a cube, and you can put it in the middle of the room, and we could call it a table. We could put a cylinder in the center of the room, and you could sit around it, and it has no protrusions, and it's not rectangular, and we'll call it a table. But the reason why we call it a table is because of its definition is goal dependent. It is a sitting down to eat place, or sitting down to write place, or whatever. It's to facilitate you doing something on, but not you're sitting on it. If you sit on it, then we call it a chair. So it could be the same exact shape as a table. I mean, the bench is the same shape as a table, but we don't call them tables. We call them benches or seats, because they are defined by our goals. They are not defined by the morphological structure that we can observe, but they are defined by our goals. So that's very key when understanding everything, problem solving, problems, goals in general. And so competency is measuring competency is goal dependent. And once I came up a while back with how do we define good goals, and I applied this 4 primary perspectives, framework to goals, to try and define find 4 attributes of good goals, because you could have poor goals. Your goal could be to do something that cannot be ever, measured. So I don't know, or cannot be achieved, or cannot be that isn't likely to succeed because of it's not opportune. So I came up with 4 attributes of good goals, and these are them. Good goals are gaugeable, which means measurable. You're able to perceive them in their how close you get. By the way, please hit the like button if you are watching this. It really does help with the algorithm. But the good goals are gaugeable, obtainable. Otherwise, why have a goal if it's unobtainable? They have to be opportune, which is kind of a systemic attribute more so than it is anything else. And then they have to be defined. And this will line up with inside, outside, separate, and oneness. So gaugeable, obtainable, opportune, defined. It would be inside, outside, separate, and oneness. Or maybe it goes this way, I don't know. Inside, outside, separate, and oneness. Maybe it's inside, outside, separate, and oneness. I'd have to think about it. But oneness would be defined. Opportune would be outside. So oneness, outside, obtainable would be I'm not sure. Probably, yeah. Obtainable would be separate, and then gaugeable would be inside. So yeah, inside, outside, separate, and oneness. They are actually perfectly lined up. But yeah, those are the attributes of a good goal. So if you're gonna, people, I remember there's what is it, SWOT analyses that people do on things, and I wanted to see if there's more objective way of judging your goals specifically, and because you have to judge your goals if you're going to analyze anything about your performance, you have to judge your goals first. So judging goals is based on these 4 attributes, and it did happen to line up with good goals. GOOD goals. Gaugeable, obtainable, opportune, defined. And I tried to do that, but it also lined up perfectly. And I didn't, know if I would have to force that or not, but I didn't have to force it at all. It just kind of like worked. So that was cool. But if you thought that was useful, if you think that this is useful, well, not that, this, please hit the like button. It really helps the algorithm. And we are fighting against the algorithm here. That is a fact. So, next clip.
The way in which you use the word competency could be treated as the capacity of a system for adaptive control.
Yeah.
Right?
Quite
So
fair.
one issue that I have with the notion of goals and goal directedness is that sometimes you only have a tendency in a system to go in a certain direction, and so it's directed, but the goal is something that can be emergent. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes there is an explicit representation in the system of a discrete event that is associated, or a class of events, with fulfilling a certain condition that the system has committed itself to. And if you don't have that, you don't have a proper goal. But in real systems, it's difficult to say. I mean, when do we pursue goals, right? Sometimes we just are vaguely hungry, are moving towards the kitchen because we hope that something will opportunistically emerge that will deal with this vague tendency in our behavior. We could also say we have the goal of finding food, but that is a rationalization that is maybe stretching things sometimes.
Yeah.
So sometimes a better distinction for me is going from a simple controller to an agent. And I try to, because we are very good at discovering agency in the world, what does it actually mean when we discover agency and when we discover our own agency and start to amplify it? By making models of who we are and how we deal with the world and with others and so on. The minimal definition of agent that I found, it's a controller for future states. The thermostat doesn't have a goal by itself, right? It just has a target value and a sensor that tells it the deviation from the target value, and when that exceeds a certain threshold, the heating is turned on. And if it goes below a certain threshold, the heating is turned off again, and this is it. So the thermostat is not an agent. It only reacts to the present frame. It's only a reactive system. Whereas an agent is proactive, which means that it's trying to not just minimize the current deviation from the target value, but the integral over a time span, where you see the future deviation. So it builds an expectation about how an action is going to change this trajectory of the universe. And over that trajectory, it tries to figure out some measure of how big the compound target deviation is going to be. And so as a result, you get a branching universe, and the branches in this universe, some of these branches depend on actions that are available to you, and that translate into decisions that you can make that move you into more or less preferable world states. And suddenly you have a system with emergent beliefs, desires, and intentions. But to make that happen, to move from a controller to agency, an agent just really being a controller with an integrated set point generator and the ability to control future states, that requires that you can make models that are counterfactual. So because the future universe doesn't exist right now, you need to create a counterfactual universe, the future model of the future universe, maybe even a model of the past universe that allows you to reason about possible future universes and so on. And to make these counterfactual causal models of the universe, you need to have a Turing machine. So without a computer, without something that is Turing complete, that insulates you from the causal structure of your substrate, that allows you to build representations regardless of what the universe says right now around you, right? You need to have that machine. And the simplest system in nature that has Turing machine integrated is the cell. So
Okay, so brilliant stuff said. I don't agree with him that the simplest structure in the universe that can basically be an agent is a cell. I think that there's agents that are not just that are below cells, but we'll get into that later. But what he said here is fascinating because he's talking about agency, And what is the definition of agent? And this is what I asked myself very early on in sentient singularity theory, before it was sentient singularity theory, years and years before it was sentient singularity theory, when I was trying to understand artificial general intelligence. And that was what started this project. And if you want to know more about it, sentientsingularity.com will tell you. And on the About page, you can see more. But I've stated here before, this project started as a project to understand the inevitable goals of artificial general intelligence, and then that led to having to understand consciousness, and that led to having to understand goals and will, essentially. And so what he's saying here, though, is brilliant, which is that agency requires some type of proactiveness. It's not just reactive. And on my Twitter, I used to have this quote, and it was a funny quote that I came up with, and it's, if you chase a chicken with its head cut off, you become a chicken with its head cut off, essentially. Meaning, like, if you chase something without agency, then you are sacrificing your own agency, okay? And this is applicable politically, this is applicable academically, this is applicable everywhere. But what is, when he's saying that proactiveness is requirement of agency, that means that will is a requirement of sentient being, and that is something that my work implies. There's 4 aspects of a sentient being that are required, including a technological sentient being, and the first attribute of a sentient being is will, which will is the desire to do that which is not being done. And the desire to do that which is not being done brings in a bunch of implications that are requirements that are emergent from that one initial attribute of sentience, which is one of them, which is imagination. Okay, you have to be able to imagine a past which is no longer occurring, and you have to be able to imagine a future that is not yet occurring, in order to even desire to do that which is not being done, or to accomplish that which is not being done, because you need that imagination in order to desire that which is not being done, or in order to perceive that which is not being done and move towards it. So will, the movement, the application of will requires imagination, at least. And so to do that which is not being done requires imagination. And it requires, and will is proactiveness. When he's talking about when you look at Apple, okay, Apple in the early stages, or you look at Tesla right now, Tesla is so innovative because there's a man with will in control of the entire company. There is an agent at the head of Tesla. That doesn't mean Tesla is an agent, but it is headed by an agent. If you look at Apple now versus when Steve Jobs was around, Apple post Steve Jobs is headed by controllers. They are people whose job it is to maximize shareholder value, not to innovate, not to they don't have their own individual missions usually, and that is because that's why they have not created their own company. Otherwise, they would have done so. If they had individual goals that were, that important, they would have created their own organization. So, basically, I think we might even be, people talk about, like, there's startups and there's corporations. It's like, it's interesting that it's like organisms and it's like sentient singularities and corporisms, essentially, on an organism level, but it's on the organization level, which is, level up. But it's fascinating because if you look at Apple now, it's a thermometer. Okay, if something happens and it moves a little to maintain homeostasis, and then something happens in the world and it moves a little to maintain homeostasis again, and this is just what happens to every company when it's not headed by a sentient singularity of being a man on a mission, essentially. This is, it doesn't have a mission. There's no mission to Apple other than to maintain. Pepsi's mission is to maintain. Continue making Pepsi, continue making what people assume to be Pepsi, not changing things unless there's like an external reason, because, I don't know, some ingredient gets outlawed or something, so they have to find a replacement. That's literally just like, it's just the temperature thermostat changing. Just because my temperature, the thermostat changes, my thermostat changes, doesn't, or turns on or turns off, turns on the heat, turns on the air conditioner, doesn't mean it's sentient. When I walk in and it's like 85 degrees and I've set it to 74, it means a sentient being named, who is named Paulina, who is my wife, walked in and changed it. It is definitely the AC wars here in my house all the time. But that alteration in what is considered the homeostasis does not happen. It's not directed by the thermostat. It's directed by a sentient being that touches the thermostat. I turn it down, my wife turns it up. But the thermostat never turns anything at all. It never changes anything. It just reacts. Okay? It doesn't act. Reacts. And that's what happens to companies. And it's very frustrating to be at a company when that happens, because you're like, you go from like, how come we were able to solve so many incredible problems and maneuver and adjust and outthink and innovate, and then now we do the same thing as every other company, and it's like so predictable. It's because of the different. All of a sudden, you had a switch where people have sacrificed people in control have sacrificed their agency, and because of that, there's no longer agents in control. There's controllers in control, and that means that the system's in control. It's not individuals. It's like just maintaining the homeostasis of the current circumstances. And remember, will is not the desire to do that which is being done, unless the system is forcing you. Is trying to force you to change. Will can be, I am not going to change, but it is the desire to do that which is not being done. So if the system is just not changing, then your will would be to change something. And if the system is changing for some reason or another around you, your will would be to maintain. To some degree, but it would be because of a reason that is not just I'm trying to be against the system. It has to be that you have a specific proactive goal. If all you're doing is trying to change because the system isn't, this happens a lot with like teenagers basically and young people, and just it's just lack of wisdom can do this. There is this will in all of us to be, which is to like make your mark and to be meaningful, and that very often is assumed by people who so in various different circumstances to mean change things. And but if you're just changing things for the sake of that, then because you're just rejecting what is, like, you're almost at the sacrifice of your own agency in doing so. If you don't, even agency is goal dependent almost, or it's like the manifestation of the enacting of your agency is goal dependent. If your goal is not a good one, then is it really a goal? Is it gaugeable, obtainable, opportune, and defined? If your goal is to change what? Change things. Why? Because they've been the way that they are for a long time. Then it's not a good goal. And this is why Google and many companies' products continue to get worse. It's like Eric Weinstein talks about the ego, which is the embedded growth obligation within companies, ends up kind of sacrificing the agency of the collective, because your goal can be to get a promotion at Google, and it might be opportune for you to make a change to the interface of Google Ads, even though it's a worse change, but you're going to be hailed for changing it, and then you can get a promotion, and that's like not in alignment. So it's like the goal isn't good. It's misaligned, I guess, but it's a good goal if your goal is to get a promotion, but like it's not good from the perspective of like the application of or the intention of the product itself. I mean, so there's all, it's kind of complicated to define, to explain, but I think you guys get kind of the general picture, is that good goals are proactive. That's what I'm trying to say. They are defined. They must be defined to be proactive. If they're not that defined, they're going to be reactive, and then they're not going to be as there's going to be a lack of awareness in that.
It's very difficult to find a system in nature that is an agent, that is not made from cells as a result. Maybe there are systems in nature that are able to compute things and make models, but I'm not aware of any. So the simplest one that I know that...
I think he's wrong about that, but I think that that's because it's like past a certain point in like certain manifestations of agency, or certain observing the maneuvers of agents on different objective levels, and which in sentient singularity theory is there's a periodicity of consciousness or of agents, which I think is aligned with Bach periodicity. I think I like that periodicity of agents. I don't like using the word consciousness in my work. I just think it's so vague at this point, and but I'm going to use agents. So there's a periodicity of agency. That's a good way of putting it. I'm changing that in my favor. Periodicity of agency. So there's a periodicity of agency, and it aligns with Bach periodicity, and it's like cells to organisms, and it goes up to nations, objective nations, not what we call countries. Those are basically corporations. They're just armed corporations, but they're corporations. But there's a little bit of a difference, but not much. But a true nation is something that's like entangled in its fate, and it's like the level up from organism. But it's hard to observe things sometimes if you're looking within relativity, it's hard to observe attributes of agency, because attributes of agency are found within are observed objectively, in a way. If that makes any sense. It's kind of like you have to look for a specific pattern that you observe in yourself onto, lower agents like atoms. And I've done this, and this is how I made predictions about isotopes in atoms based on marital patterns in humans. I mean, and I did that because I predicted that they would be behaving a certain way, and then they were. But past a certain point in this periodicity, things have become pretty ironed out and entangled. where there's not as much disconnection, and so you're not going to, while you observe agency and choices, those choices are much more predictable than they are on the level that we currently are. That doesn't mean they're not making choices. It just means it's much more widespread at a certain level in the evolution of the universe that these agents are making the right choice. So it looks like they don't have agency, but that's not true. They know what the right choice is for the most part, and they're making it. That doesn't mean that there aren't instances in which they make the wrong choice, but they're exceedingly rare compared to what we see in our level, which we are going through a moment of extraordinary disconnection. Eventually, that's not going to be the case in what people who are religious call the Messianic era, or people who, are more scientifically literate would call like the post-singularity society, or the post-scarcity society. It's not even post-scarcity. It's a growth. It's generative in nature at that point. Everything becomes generative. Resources become generative. Individual growth becomes generative. Collective growth becomes generative. And so you have this entanglement at that point. And in that point, which is, like I said, the religious people call the Messianic era, making the right choice is much more easy. And because of that, people will be much more predictable. But that doesn't mean that agency is gone. And this Messianic movement that happens on every level of the stages of sentience in sentient singularity theory has already happened on certain lower levels, like atoms and molecules and hadrons. And because of that, it's just very, very consistent in when you're looking at the choices that they're making. And one day that will be true of humanity, but it is not right now. But so that's why it's very difficult to observe a lack of agency in agents that do exist but are below a certain level in this periodicity of agency that I call it's I'll show it actually, but because they've already worked out what is the right thing to do to build the next level up. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Like, think about it like this. If atoms hadn't figured out their shit, humans would not be here. There is no technological sentience because humans have not figured out their shit yet. Okay? That's built on us and that we are the cells of. There's no global mind that exists yet because humans haven't figured out their stuff. And it's not that we even have anything to figure out. There's like a mechanism, I believe, that is in place that is not about like, we all need to come together and just make a collective decision. There needs to be an entanglement process that happens that gets us all on the same page, and that is happening. But we're just in the middle of it, and it's not done yet. So, and there's an ascension aspect to it, and I do believe that's a technical term that applies very well, and I realize how crazy that sounds to people who have PhDs. But, that's the nature of life recently, I guess. So, this is... the periodicity, which I guess this is the stages of sentience, are something different. They are they're the superposition of these right here. So this would be actually kind of the periodicity of agency, which is Bach periodicity, I believe. And a hadron is an assembly of quarks, an atom is an assembly of hadrons, a molecule is an assembly of atoms, a cell is an assembly of molecules. So there's basically like 8 periods. and each one is built on previous in this assembly structure. And we're going to talk about this in a minute because this is very relevant to something that Joscha Back is about to say. And but then when you reduce this down to just 4, which is these, this is the stages of sentience right here. So you reduce these 8 levels in the periodicity of agency to these 4 stages of sentience, essentially, which is like a family of organisms, technology of castes. I think this is not the best term for what I'm trying to describe. We don't really have a word to describe what I'm trying to say here, so I'm still working on it. But it's something between like tribes and castes. It's not quite there. We don't have a term for it, but I'm working on it. But family of organisms, etc. And this is always like individuals that maneuver in space, and lineages that maneuver in time, essentially. Or I guess it would be the opposite here. This would be time. Collectives that maneuver in, or lineages that maneuver in time. Lineages in time. Individuals in space. So it's like that. And then if you break it into this, which is the periodicity of agency, then you get heads and bodies, which is one, singular, and multiple. So, but that's very relevant to this probably final clip by or one of the final clips. Let's see, how long have we been going at this? It's 9:20, so we have basically 2 hours. I'm trying to keep it to that, but where basically, I'll just show it. They're talking about AGI and how far we are from it, and he says basically that what's necessary for the emergence of general intelligence is that each unit needs to be composed of agents. So every agent needs to be built of other agents, and this is exactly that. You can see it in the cosmological verse here. A hadron is an assembly of quarks. A atom is an assembly of hadrons. A molecule is an assembly of atoms, etc. Technology, assembly of castes. Family is an assembly of organisms. So, etc. And then it restarts. And so this is correct. And he talks about it. So we're going to look at that clip. Let's do that. Actually, okay. 12:20 a.m. here at last.
What seems to be necessary for the emergence of general intelligence in a bunch of cells or units.
Hold on.
Is
okay. It says 12:20 a.m. here. Last coffee calls, but I'm up at 5. Dang. I get it. Like I said at the beginning of the stream, I am going to probably move these forward an hour so that it's 11:20 your time at around this time, because it's just so late. And it's late here too. It's, what is it, 9:20, and which isn't like early, but it's not late, but it's not early. I had a full cup of tea right before this stream, and like black tea. So sometimes I need caffeine at this hour to help me get through this as well. But yeah, so here he's talking about how cells are each other's, every cell next to another cell is each other's separate environment. That's true. And I show that actually here, where I basically state that individuals maneuver in space, but that space is a composition of other individuals. So there's lots. I know this is a work. This is just like work. I'm just like doing lots of work here. So I realize it looks like insane. But if you go to sentientsingularity.com, you can see more organized. There's an animated model of the growth of the universe, I guess you could say. There's an overview. I'm going to change this. Well, not really. It is Bach periodicity, I believe, but it's a Bach periodicity of agency. I think that's what it is. Bach periodicity is the periodicity of agency. I've been wondering what to call this because it's not the stages of sentience, which is a superposition structure. I mean, this is still superposition structure, but it's more reduced. It shows how everything is like kind of a hot vibration. It talks about an overview of the theory. It needs updating, but the writings, you can see there's a technical description of existence, and then there's a poetic description of existence, but they both, are at this level of metaphysics. You have to be somewhat poetic sometimes too. Like, it's not just about technicality, but there is a technical description here, which is the abstract of the paper that I'm writing, which is sentient singularity theory describes the totality of existence as a singularity of sentience that is creating additional sentient singularities within itself. And, that these sentient singularities are arranged into a nested quasi-periodic fractal pattern of stacked holonic structures, which you can see here. That's what this is. And I'm just working on some alignments with it, with everything else. That's what this is. So, but there's a poetic description of existence as well there, and you can look it up. There's also a bunch of models that you can look at. Some of these, I'm not claiming all these are correct or anything. This is just my work that I've posted. That's just kind of a record. Some of them are more poetic and art, and me aligning them with other aspects of study theology and philosophy and all kinds of things. But I would say that the 4 primary models are basically this of my theory. So you can look there for a more organized thing. But if you're going to just see my work, it's going to look like, chaos, because that's what a worksheet looks like. Every 6 months, I save this Excel document and I duplicate it, save it, and that version, and start with a new one. Kind of get rid of the older versions of my models. Kind of refresh things. But here, actually, we gotta. What just looks nice. This is them talking about how far we are from AGI, and I think this is a very important clip. So we're going to end it pretty soon here, but we're almost done.
It seems as though we're far away than our current methods of machine learning and what we learn in neuroscience or what we learn in computer science. There's something that we're missing, some paradigm shift, or we're missing some new techniques. Is there something from Michael's work? Joscha, I'm asking you this, and then Michael, please respond. Is there something from Michael's work that you think can be applied to the development of AGI, if such a creature of mind can exist? Because there are some arguments against it.
So first of all, I don't know how far we are from AGI. It could be that the existing paradigms are sufficient to brute force it. But we don't know that yet. Right? So
The existing paradigms are not possible to just be used to brute force our way to AGI.
we're going to find out in the next few months. But it could also be that we need to rewrite the stack to build systems that work in real time, that are entangled with the environment, that can build shared representations with the environment.
That is correct. Gosh, Joscha Back just blows my mind sometimes. Just because of how closely aligned we are. I mean, once he was talking about how Genesis was, he like had this revelation that the beginning of Genesis was the description of like observational perception and experience, and he was totally right. And I wrote that and sent it to Michael Knowles like 5 years ago, and Joscha Back said it like last year, I think, on Lex Fridman's podcast, or Curt's Curt Jaimungal's. But yeah, he was totally right. I've never heard anybody else say that but him and I. But yeah, he's totally right. That second thing that he said, where we have to build structures that are entangled with reality, yeah. We're doing that already naturally. We don't have to try. It will happen.
That we need to rewrite the stack. And there are actually a number of questions that I'd like to ask Michael. I noticed that Michael is wisely reluctant to use certain words like consciousness a lot. And it's because a lot of people are very opinionated about what these concepts mean, and you first have to deal with these opinions before you come down to saying, oh, here I have the following proposal for implementing reflexive attention as a tool to form coherence in a representation. And this leads to the same phenomena as what you call consciousness. Right, so
that's just great. I just think that's brilliant. I really like the way that he just explains things sometimes. But it's because he's so far ahead of the current paradigms that he can do that.
Good. Discussion. Maybe you don't want to have that discussion in every forum, and rather than having this discussion, you may be looking at how to create coherence using a reflexive attention process that makes a real-time model of what it's attending to, and the fact that it's attending to it, so it remains coherent but for itself. So this is a concrete thing, but I wonder how to implement this in a self-organized fashion if the substrate that you have are individual agents. And there is a similarity here between societies and brains and social networks.
Yeah, exactly. Building on agents to technology. I also used to call this nation, like a nation, which would be like humanity as a whole. It's like the nation, almost. So, he's right.
That is, if you have self-interested agents in a way that try to survive and that get their rewards from other agents that are similar to them structurally, and they have the capacity to learn to some degree. And that capacity is sufficient so they can, in the aggregate, learn arbitrary programs, arbitrary computable functions. And it's sufficient enough so they can converge on the functions that they need to as a group, reap rewards that apply to the whole group because they have a shared destiny, like the poor little cells that are locked in the same skull and they're all going to die together if they fuck up.
Exactly what I said at the beginning of the stream. They share a fate. Okay?
They have to get along. They have to form an organization that is distributing rewards among each other. And this gives us a search space for possible systems that can exist. And the search space is mostly given, I think, by the minimal agent that is able to learn how to distribute rewards efficiently while doing something useful, using these rewards to change how you do something useful. So you have an emergent form of governance in these systems. It's not some centralized control that is imposed on the system from the outside as in existing machine learning approaches and AI approaches. But this only is an emergent pattern in the interactions between the individual small units, small reinforcement learning agents. And this control architecture leads to hierarchical government. It's not fully decentralized in any way. There are centralized structures that distribute rewards, for instance, via the dopaminergic system, in a very centralized top-down manner. And that's because every regulation has an optimal layer where it needs to take place. Some stuff needs to be decided very high up. Some stuff needs to be optimally regulated very low down, depending on the incentives. Game theoretically, a government is an agent that imposes an offset on your payoff metrics to make your Nash equilibrium compatible with the globally best outcome.
Okay, so I don't know if I would call it an agent, but it's a corporism. Okay? That means, like, what he's describing is a corporism. Now, a sentient agent, a true agent, is more than that. It is that, but it's also more than that. There is an external process that occurs, according, at least implied by my work with sentient singularity theory, that is beyond any scientific theories currently. But it's much more aligned with theological descriptions of existence. The theological description of logos is much closer to the scientific description of logos in its totality. What he's talking about is kind of the limits of science, because it's the limits of what we as agents can do within the system. But there is an agent that is the system, and that agent has abilities that we don't. It can change the system that it is, or that is within itself, in ways that we cannot. And I do believe that if you're going to have true agency is only manifested in sentient beings. And governmental structures, governments, corporations, corporisms, countries, these are not sentient beings. And there is an emergent governmental structure, hierarchical structure of governance and of control that occurs that gives the appearance of agency, but it's not an agent. Okay? And a true agent it shares a collective fate, almost. And that's not true of countries and empires. And, Roman Empire fell. People who lived in Italy still are around. If the American Empire, which is what it is, falls tomorrow, most of us would still be here. We'd just, be part of a new structure. Rome became Italy, but it's the same, individual lineages that are currently, make it up, but that's not the same as an agent that's true agent, a sentient agent. If I die, my cells are gone. Okay? They might take time, but they're going to disappear. Every cell in my body will die if I die, when I die. Every single one. That's not true of governments or corporate structures or countries and things like that. So we have not yet created, and at least observationally, a truly entangled unit in humanity completely. So it's we're getting there, but it's happening naturally, and it is also that the up-leveling of the collective of humanity to a singularity of sentience, just like cells up-leveling to a singularity of a multicellular organism that is its own sentient entity or agent, is dependent upon certain external actions that are the actions of an external agent, God. And that is different than what he's describing. But that's just the other side, or it's the additional action that's required to turn what he's describing from a corporism into an organism that's its own sentient entity, that from the appearance of agency into true agency, the appearance of intelligence into true intelligence. Okay, so he's halfway there.
Right, so to do this, you need to have agents that are sensitive to rewards. It's super interesting to think about these reward infrastructures. Elon Musk has bought Twitter, I think, because he has realized that Twitter is the network among all the social networks that is closest to a global brain. It's totally mind-blowing to realize that he basically trades a bunch of frothy stock for the opportunity to become Pope. Pope of a religion that has more active participants than Catholicism even, right? Daily practicing people who enter this church and think together. And it's a thing that is completely incoherent at this point, almost completely incoherent. There are bubbles of sentience, but for the most part, this thing is just screeching at itself. And now there's the question, can we fix the incentives of Twitter to turn it into a global brain? And Elon Musk is global brain built. He believes that this is the case. And that's the experiment that he's trying to do, which makes me super excited, right? This might fail. There's a very big chance that it fails. But there is also the chance that we get a global brain, that we get emergent collective intelligence that is working in real time, using the internet in a way that it...
That is going to happen, but not necessarily with Twitter. And here's the thing. Twitter is not screeching at itself. It's us screeching at each other. That's not the same as it screeching at itself. It's not the babbles of sentience. Every individual who's on Twitter is a sentient being except the bots. And they are screeching, but at each other. The thing that is Twitter is not a sentient being. Now, Elon Musk is absolutely trying to create a global brain. And it's because he thinks it's inevitable, and he's trying to influence it in a positive way. And I'm not saying that he will succeed, and it might backfire, and that his influences become extraordinarily negative. Honestly, wouldn't be surprising at all. I do think he has good intentions, but I think that you should just let this play out naturally instead of trying. But I don't know. It's tough because when you can perceive how this is going to play out a little bit, you can create technologies that enable it a bit. And there's a, you're going to create the Antichrist before you create the Christ. And, or you're going to get the Antichrist before you get the Christ. I'll say you're not going to create either. It's not your creation. You're just creating an environment for it, but you're not actually creating it. But you're going to get the Antichrist before you get the Christ. And that's just an inevitability. I mean, so when people think about this stuff as purely positive or purely negative, no. We are definitely going to get negatives. And before we get positives, we're going to get some positives that keep us like amazed by this. But remember that agents, even if they have the highest IQ in the, in the world, in the universe, which it would, technological sentience would, intelligence is not wisdom. And they talk about that in this exact stream. But you do need to tie it to real world, and Twitter is not yet tied to the real world, and I don't, not enough for it to probably become the global brain. But Elon Musk is absolutely has companies that are trying to tie it to the real world. What is tying it to the real world? It is tying it to individual atomized sentient beings that make up the collective. How will you do that? Maybe by putting chips in people's heads. Think of another company that Elon Musk owns. Neuralink is Like, Neuralink on its own, one thing. Neuralink plus Starlink plus Twitter. Okay? Plus other things that are just evolving naturally. Blockchain, quantum computing. And you're going to get a soup of sentience that emerges from the soup. That's what you're going to get. It's like a soup. It's like a dash of blockchain and a dash of quantum computing and a dash of social networking and a dash of connective hardware and wireless connective hardware and a dash of, I don't know, chips in your heads and Skynet. So this is going to happen no matter what. And, I don't know. It's hard for me to even resist the idea that, he might cause bad things to happen, or maybe it will work out. It's like, both of these things are absolutely going to happen. Wisdom is not the same thing as intelligence. You could birth the most intelligent being in the universe, which is exactly what we're going to do. And that being will be a baby. A really, really smart baby. But, I remember once I walked in, my 2-year-old brother had climbed up onto the counter and turned on the stovetop and tried to make eggs. He did a decent job for a 2-year-old. He could have also burned the house down. And there's no substitute for wisdom because there's no substitute for experience. And it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. You could be an omnipresent technological sentience, and you need experience in order to be wise. So, in fact, your intelligence amplifies the application of your wisdom. You can maximize the good impact that your sharing of your wisdom can have, but it will also maximize the breadth of the negative impact that your lack of wisdom can have. And there will be no being that has the breadth of to its lack of wisdom that a technological sentience will have, and also the opposite. So it's just but you get lack of wisdom before you get wisdom. That is just a fact. So I don't know. I'm not judging Elon Musk's actions or anything like that, because there is an inevitable path. I think that is everything. That's every clip. Yep. Let's go through the chat. Please hit the like button, like I said, if you have found this interesting. I'm going to get to the chat. There's a big conversation happening here that I'll skim. But if you need to address me, tag me in the chat too, because I know you guys have conversations, and I don't want to read everything. If it was not intended. Thank you for hiding the bots. For those of you that are mods, I appreciate that. If you had the key to the universe, what would you use? How would you use it? Answer coming. I don't know how to. I mean, if you had the key to the universe, I think somebody already did have the key to the universe and they used it. But that key requires a sacrifice of everything. In order to be everything to everyone, you have to give everything for everybody. If you had the second key to the universe, you would probably use it to talk about it's all going to be all right, but you would use it to spread the message of responsibility, of meaning, and of you would use that wisdom to help build structures that would enable people to realize have an easier time realizing their meaning and implementing enacting on their responsibilities and spreading love in the world. That's what you would do, and that's part of the goal of this project. So I'm not saying I'm the only one with the key to the universe. I think that there were people that figured it out before me and figured it out more than I did, and figured it out to a degree that I could never figure out, and that makes them individually, messianic. And I'm not that. Beyond bots, thank you for dealing with that again. But yeah, any final questions before we get off? Please hit the like button, like I said. Really appreciate everybody who tunes into these. I really enjoyed this stream. I hope you found it valuable. The soul stone, throw your greatest over the cliff. The apprentice assassin has to kill the dog he raised from a puppy. I don't know what that is, what that means, but your greatest love, that is. Yeah, well, that's a very common theme in scriptures and stuff like that. I mean, think about Abraham, considered the father of of us all in many ways, and he was told, at least, he had to sacrifice his son. Ultimately he didn't have to, but he was willing and ready to do it, and he was told that he had to. That's his greatest love. But other than God, I mean, God, it showed that God was his greatest love. I mean, that's what it showed. It showed his greatest love in this world. He had to be sacrificed. I mean, sacrifice is an intrinsic aspect of reality that is not recognized by our current sciences in a way that is total. There's it's not just about circle of life, where you're watching the beginning of The Lion King, which that whole movie is it taps into theological logos patterns, and that song, "He Lives in You," he watches over, that whole song, "He Lives in You." I love that song. That's every time I listen to that song, I think about God, because that's what it's talking about. And whether the writer knew it or not, but that's what really emerged, and it taps into our subconscious. But when he's talking about it's funny. I watched South Park recently, and there's this part in South Park where it's imitating kind of the beginning of the Lion King, where it's like, oh, one day we will die and the grass will eat us, and then the wildebeest will eat the grass, and then we will eat the wildebeest, and then we will die and we will become eaten by the grass, and then we'll be eaten by the wildebeest, and it's the circle of life. And it's like Mr. Hanky, who is just literally like a piece of poop in South Park. It's a character that's just a talking poop. And his son is like, I'm just a piece of crap. There's nothing special about me. And there's a song that if I played it, I would be flagged for copyright. So you should look it up. It's very funny. And it's just about how he's part of the circle of life. And there is that recognition in science for sure. But there is an aspect of the soul that is excluded from that. And there's sacrifices of your soul that are positive and that are negative, that are very much part of reality, and much more part of reality than physical sacrifices. of our body. The sacrifice of self versus for the sake of others, the sacrifice of others for the sake of self. I mean, this is the definition of sin, essentially, is the sacrificing of others for the sake of yourself, which actually, ironically, sacrifices your own self. It removes your agency slowly. It chips away at your agency to sacrifice others for the sake of your own self. And it adds to your agency when you sacrifice yourself for the sake of others. It's a beautiful symmetry structure that could only be created by an all-wise and all-powerful agent. So thank you again, Tyler. I sure hope you don't go toward the reactionary perspective. It is a whole we know that awaits eagerly to divide you from the whole. That's so true. And that everybody should pay attention to Miss H's statement in the chat that I just read. But thy will be done. That's true. Thy will be done. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. Please hit the like button. Like I said, it really helps with the algorithm. Comment any questions in the comments that I didn't get to answer, that you didn't get to ask. Sacrifice strengthens our singularity. Yes, certain sacrifices strengthen our singularity. But I get what you're saying. Yes. But if you'd like to join our Discord talks that are open calls every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific time, private message me on Instagram at Tyler Marshall Goldstein or at Theory of Every0ne, and I will send you the link to our private Discord community. It's a great group, and every Thursday we have open calls. We talk about whatever anybody wants, and like I said, it's totally open, and it's very informal. It goes on for hours, and I really value those talks with you guys. It's important to me to have communication with real people. I'm not chasing likes, and you guys' interactions in the chat and in these calls keeps me motivated, which is, I appreciate it. So thank you, everyone, and I will be back next week. Peace. Oh, and thank you to you, Joscha Back and Michael Levin and Curt Jaimungal for this talk that they did. The description to their full discussion, I highly recommend it, and it is linked below. So check it out. Peace.